Thanks so much. And thanks, everybody, for taking time out of your busy day for today's webcast. And I'll be introducing Pete here in a moment, but before we get to that, just a couple things I wanted to mention. First of all, if you're looking for other great products and services and resources from the TOC group, you can find it at O'Reilly.com/TOC. Also, if you missed our big New York event last week, you missed quite a bit. But if you didn't go, we've got a new offering this year that we're about to release probably in the next couple weeks, and that is a video compilation product. So we recorded every session, all the keynotes, all the breakouts, and everything else, and we will be publishing that probably in the next couple of weeks, and I believe Catherine or Yaz are going to push out a URL that you can go to find more information on it. So would encourage you to take a look at that, and we'd love your feedback on it. So before I introduce Pete here, what I wanted to do was to talk for a moment about a project that Pete has helped us get off the ground and really spearheaded for us, and it's this Breaking the Page. We produced and released the first chunk of it in a preview edition several weeks ago, and you can get more information through that shortened URL there or through that QR code. But I wanted to mention that this is a really, I think, fascinating project for O'Reilly and for all of publishing, because there's so much terrific content in here that Pete has to offer in terms of his vision for where publishing is going. And this preview edition is totally free, so you can download it. Again, we'd love your feedback on it. But ultimately, later this year, we're going to release the full version of the product as Pete gets it completed. So the more input you can provide now, I think the better. And we hope you'll take a look at it and give it some consideration. So first of all, get that out of the way. And then secondly, I wanted to introduce Pete Meyers. And for those of you who have been on these webcasts before, these Digital Bookmaking Tools Roundups, you're probably expecting Pete to go through a series of maybe a half a dozen different tools and, kind of startups and different interesting things that he's come across that we can talk in detail about. We decided to take a slightly different approach with this one, and we want to get your feedback in the end. As Pete and I talked about this the other day, we realized that, there's probably a big question a lot of folks have, and that is, why would somebody go with anything other than, say, the tried and true tool like Adobe InDesign and go with maybe a startup? And so that's the kind of thing that we want to drill down into today. So, Pete, do you want to say hello to the folks?
Yeah, well, delighted to be here, Joe, talking with you. And, to Joe's point, I mean, I think that there's no end of new releases when it comes to tools. And I've talked a lot about those over the past 6 months. I blog and tweet a lot about that, and I'm definitely going to keep doing that. But I think what we were thinking about for today is it's time to sort of an opportunity to step back and dig into some of the eternal questions, questions like, what are the fundamental sort of problems that all of these tools, new and long-standing, are tackling? And in a general sort of principled kind of way, how do people evaluate, how do you start making decisions about these various tools? Again, whether it's a startup or a long-standing tool like InDesign, what are some of the principles that you can sort of think through as new tools come on the market, as you sort of weigh new ones versus old ones? So I think that's really and that will invariably get us into questions that don't specifically apply or have to do with, feature X of new tool or feature Y of new tool. It will get us into some of the things we're going to talk about later on, like, do you want to be selling your eBooks directly? That's not necessarily a tool-specific question, but it's something that's part of the decision-making process. So anyway, I think this is a kind of an interesting little bit of an experiment. We'll see how it goes, see where this conversation takes us. Really eager, in particular today, to see some of the questions that come in through the chat window, and we definitely got a time set at the end to take on those as well.
Yeah, and I think one other way we want to kind of frame this is just thinking a little bit about how big the major players are, right? So I think you've seen different sets of numbers, as have I, Pete, that would indicate that maybe Amazon, as far as ebooks are concerned, represents maybe 60-some% of the market, and the next biggest player is apparently Barnes & Noble at half or less of what Amazon's share is. So I think what a lot of people are asking themselves is, why would I want to go with any other platform other than those two, let's say, which captures so much of the market?
And that's exactly right. I mean, that's a really, there's a contention or a claim to be made that certainly gets made fairly often that, boy, it's really complicated and challenging to do ebook publishing in 2012 because there are so many different places to publish on the web, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, the iBook store, and on and on. But you can also look at that completely differently, and you can say, if I did nothing other than sell my ebook on Amazon, then yes, I would be missing out on some percentage of the market that probably amounts to about 30-ish, 35-ish. But think about all the logistical pain that I saved myself. So I think that approach makes no sense for a big publisher that wants to be in all places, but for a small publisher, for an independent author just getting started, I think it's an interesting question to consider. Is there a time when it does make sense to just go directly with Amazon and to simplify your publishing chores? Of course, it doesn't make sense for everyone, but it's an interesting one. It's an interesting question to kind of chew on, and we'll get into a little bit more of that, I think, later on.
So, up to now, Pete, I feel like in the two prior Tools Roundups webcasts that you've done, you've answered the what question of, what are these other tools and what are the options I should look at? And as this slide shows, we want to try to tackle why. Why would somebody want to think of something else? And to start off there, I just feel like you got to ask this question, why would I want to be a pioneer? And as I've said to you before, aren't they the ones with the arrows in their back? So, what's your response to that?
Well, I think the sort of the reason that most people should have for experimenting with a non-traditional tool, let's call it for sake of brevity, let's call it something other than InDesign, is because InDesign is not doing, is not fulfilling your needs to create complex and innovative enhancements. Clearly, if you want to move away from traditional EPUB/MOBI ebooks that are being sold on, the Kindle store, the iBook store, and the Nook store, then you need to start thinking about other more complex tools. But I think that immediately gets us into this sort of related question, which is, what is the market for enhancements? Are people really going to pay for these extras that are not currently supported by the main e-reading systems? And here I think it's an interesting time, depending on where you want to say this whole digital publishing revolution started. But let's, for sake of a one point of reference, say since the introduction of the iPad, in the spring of 2010, has there been a substantial market for enhanced ebooks? And I think in the majority of cases, the answer has to be not really. There are clearly success stories. TouchPress is one. They've done quite well. You can look at kids' books, apps, and as a whole, that category has generated an interesting amount of revenue. But for individual publishers, I'm not really sure, aside from a handful, that there really has been a lot of kind of interesting success stories. So this, to me, then comes back to, well, what are the arguments for going with a non-traditional tool, for a startup tool? And you really have to, I think, get your head around or come up with a list of reasons where, to go back to Adobe InDesign, and this is most definitely not a 45-minute commercial for Adobe, but you have to come up with a reason why, something more than I don't want to spend $600 with Adobe, because right now InDesign, it A, is a decent tool that keeps getting better, and B, provides a really nice path from InDesign to EPUB that will, most assuredly just keep getting better as new versions come out, and we know new versions keep coming out.
Yeah, so I wonder if we can kind of also tackle this from the reader point of view, right? Because now I'm going to put my consumer hat on for a moment and tell you that I'm dying to get more products like, the Elements from TouchPress that you mentioned, and the Solar System and so forth, which are more exploration maybe than any sort of like a serial reading experience. And a quote that comes to mind for me is that old Henry Ford one of, if I would have listened to my prospective customers, I just would have built a faster horse, implying that, gee, we don't really need all these bells and whistles. But again, now as a publisher, I feel frustrated because the dominant players and their reader apps are moving at a glacial pace. Now, do you feel like I'm kind of in the minority with that? Do you feel like there's not much of a demand there? I mean, what's your opinion?
No, I think, first of all, I think it's a great quote and very apt, and with all respect, to respect all the readers out there, and I include myself in them, they don't really know what they want, I think, until they see it. I mean, let's take the Elements app, which I think is a great example of, this is from TouchPress, it's it's a app that shows how to browse through all the elements of the periodic table, and has gained a lot of attention, has made a boatload of money for that company, and yet, with all due respect to them, is not particularly innovative, I don't think. Does not really fundamentally change the reading experience from the print book version, which it derives from. And to me, what this represents, along with the dozens and hundreds and quite possibly even thousands of, competitors who are trying to sort of emulate, what TouchPress has done, is to suggest that we haven't yet cracked the nut in any substantial way to satisfy the appetite for innovation in readers like Joe and what you just said and me and everybody else out there. I mean, even let's take another kind of poster child for oohing and eyeing kind of innovation, Push Pop Press, which most people on this webcast probably know was the publisher behind Al Gore's Art Choice app, and then shortly thereafter acquired by Facebook. All that Push Pop Press was doing, and I put sort of all in quotes because it was a significant kind of creative and design accomplishment, but all they were doing was taking the print book and doing a beautiful job of rendering it on the iPad screen. Still not, I think, fundamentally changing the reading experience. And to me, so then this still is the very early innings of the digital publishing revolution. I'm convinced every time I think about this question that long-form narrative fiction and nonfiction is not going to go away. In most cases, it will go digital because that is the best way, the most economical way to deliver it. So that sort of traditional book will stay the same. But I think we're still in the very early days of seeing publishers, content creators, authors, designers, developers truly innovate with what can be done with the book. And I think the most promising innovation is not the ones and not the kinds of examples that we've so often seen to date. Even let's take, for example, what we've seen in the initial crop of textbooks launched in the iBooks 2 app using the iBooks Author software. In most cases, I would argue, I'm working on a blog post about this where I'll take it a bit further, but I would argue that these are basically traditional print books with a bunch of video dumped into them. Even some of the interactive animations that you see in a couple of the biology textbooks and some of the diagnostics and quizzes, they really, to me, have the feel of a print book that has pretty much been jammed onto the iPad, and the sort of secret sauce of interactivity and multimedia has been poured on, which incidentally is Adobe's approach with InDesign and their digital publishing suite. I mean, that is fundamentally a print publishing tool that, to Adobe's credit, has been souped up to allow for the creation of traditional EPUB ebooks and then also slightly more, complex digital publications like what you see in the New Yorker app. So long way of saying, I don't think we're quite there yet. I'll go further than that. I know we're not there yet to the point where 25 years from now, if you and I are still around and talking about this, we'll look back, I think, on the book publications, the digital book publications in 2011 and 2012, and we'll say, that's kind of quaint. I will offer this one teaser. I saw in the past 10 days or so, I got a kind of private look at a tool that is something on the order of a month to 3 away from being public. I can't say anything about the name, but I can tell you this for sure. This tool, which is being tested out and content being poured into it by some serious big-name authors and publishers, is the first tool that I've ever seen to fundamentally change the reading experience. Now, again, I'm trying to navigate, so I'm not giving away anything, but when I talk about things like changing the reading experience, I think about things like reading a nonfiction book and the accumulation of knowledge that you gather as you're making your way through the book. I just got finished reading this great book called Quiet about introverts in American culture, and the author makes a case as she writes about the ways that American culture, elevate the outgoing extrovert ideal personality, and anyone who's sort of on the quiet side is meant to try to fix their personality and become extroverted. But she makes this case, and she sort of builds it through anecdotes and pointing to research. And the traditional print book reading experience is such that as the reader, you need to kind of remember the points that she's making. In the back pocket of your mind, keep a picture of the argument that she's sort of mounting through the pages. And that's what we do when we read print books. The tool that I saw, which incidentally has nothing to do with this book called Quiet, takes a different approach and tackles problems like what the reader is trying to do as they're trying to make sense of a complexly structured argument. So there's no video. There's no, 3-minute audio introduction from the author, which examples like that make me question, well, how does that add to the reading experience? Instead, what I've seen, and whether it's in this tool that I'm being cryptic about or other tools to come, is an attempt to sort of really do a deep tissue dig into what are the problems that readers grapple with as they're trying to make sense of long-form arguments, and how can books be designed to satisfy some of those mental challenges.
Yeah, so what's interesting about that is instead of trying to be feature-rich and create some bloatware, you're thinking more about what's the compelling reason to even offer any sort of functionality, right? I've got one follow-up question on this whole why be a pioneer side of things, though, and then we can move on, and that is, and I'd like to get your take on this, I feel like right now we're in this stage where we're doing all these quick and dirty print-to-e conversions, and the product you get on your Kindle, on your iPad, whatever reader you're using, closely resembles the print product you can buy off of a store shelf. And a lot of people are kind of content with that. I mean, not readers, but actually publishers thinking, well, this is the market, right? And why should I be a pioneer? Why should I invest the money? I personally believe that we're going to see richer content take hold, and that's also going to solve another problem, and that is the downward price pressure that we've had since day one of the Kindle. So in other words, customers today, I think, have grown accustomed to expecting lower prices for ebooks because they're the print book without the portability or the convenience of pass-along, let's say, that print offers. But once we get to a model where we're taking advantage of the digital medium that these are being distributed on, and they have the features that customers are looking for, I think that prices can start going upwards from where they are now. What's your thought on that?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I think, in a lot of ways, publishers have, frankly, themselves to blame for releasing into the mainstream a product, products that I think by many measures aren't as attractive and as useful and as usable as the print version. So they're sort of devaluing the product by the design. There are things like the difficulty with sharing, which of course we can attribute not necessarily to not necessarily to all publishers, but to some of the big e-reading platforms. But in the publishers, side of things, I think without even getting into things like enhancing, feature-wise, even things like typography and page layout and quality control and, typos, I think the proliferation, and I spent a lot of time reviewing the products, the e-books out there on the market on all different devices, the proliferation of poor quality or mediocre quality publications is signaling to readers that this product that we're selling is a cheap kind of knockoff. And that directly, to me, then ties into the problem of pricing, right? I mean, if you're putting out books that aren't beautifully formatted and beautifully designed, which is what publishers have been doing for the past decades, then you're implicitly sending this message that you don't, this is not your premium product. So I'm with you. I think that there is an opportunity, even with the glut of content out there, and even with information overload, and even with all the free alternatives, for publishers to start moving in a different direction, for publishers to start staking out building their reputation in the same way that Knopf is the place where I go for great fiction, or Harlequin Romance for great romance, or O'Reilly for great tech stuff. I think there's an opportunity for a publisher, more than one publisher, to start building a reputation for, I provide great digital reading experiences. And that then involves everything from, the visual design, the inclusion of features, and also things like DRM. I've been kicking around an idea, and I'll just throw it out here quickly, that seems relevant to all this, that, in a way, isn't there an argument to be made for a DRM version of a book that's not even copyable, where the copy feature, for example, in iBooks is not active, which is a publisher controllable thing? That's the cheapest version, because you're basically putting that behind a glass wall, and you're putting it in front of the reader, and you're saying you can only look at this, and even though I, publisher, know that you, reader, know that most content on the iPad is copyable, I'm putting this content behind this sort of glass wall that you can't really touch. Make that version really cheap, and make the more useful versions, the one where the copy feature is active, make that a little bit more expensive. Now you're letting the reader control it, and you're giving the reader a better sense of ownership. Yeah, no, that's a great point. Interesting. All right, well, I want to move along to the next area we wanted to talk about, and coincidentally we have a question from the audience about this. So iBooks Author from Apple came out recently. Do you feel that's a game changer? I think anything at this point, that Apple does is, if not a slam dunk game changer, to mix metaphors, is something that has to be taken seriously. And I think the two substantial reasons that iBooks Author is worth attention is, one, because of the rich page layout capability. So for the first time, we have a tool that puts in the hands of non-coders the ability to put together pages that do things like allow a skilled designer to create a beautiful reading experience, one that flows seamlessly and fluidly between text and images and graphics, even if all those haven't yet been put together in a beautiful way. So that's number one, rich page layout. And two is just the size of the iOS market, the App Store. Even if we're just talking about iPads right now, Apple has sold about 55 million to date. I think last time I checked, about a month ago. That number will clearly, by the end of 2012, nose up against 100 million. So you clearly are, if you go the iBooks Author route, cutting yourself off from the Kindle store, the Nook store, etc. But you've got a audience that by the end of the year will number in close to 100 million, and people are one tap away from buying your content. So I do think it's significant for those two reasons. Okay, so on the flip side of that coin, then what are some of the reasons not to go with this platform? Yeah, well, I think the big one is lock-in, right? I mean, because of the terms that Apple has constructed around this software, that most people on the webcast, listening to the webcast, are probably familiar with, but they basically go like, if you want to use iBooks software, if you want to use iBooks Author, which is available for free, you can only sell the interactive version of what you create in the iBook store. You can create a weak sauce PDF version of it and give that away for free, but you really are eliminating your ability to take what you created and sell it on other e-reading platforms, for example, the Kindle Fire. So that's a substantial concern, I think, for any publisher who is trying to make sense of a world in which, notwithstanding Apple's great success, it does seem to be clear that going forward there are going to be a multiple number of platforms that publishers need to sell on for the rest of this decade and on. We are not entering a phase in which Apple becomes the Microsoft of the 21st century, which is to say that notwithstanding their success, Apple is not going to be the only, content delivery platform in the 21st century. So, the size of the market that Apple, makes available is big, but then there's going to be so much else out there. We haven't even started, I think, seeing we haven't seen what's going to happen with Windows 8, which is going to be Microsoft's first real foray into tablet computing. The Kindle Fire is clearly a success story. That's another big platform to publish on. So that's you put all those together, and if you go with iBooks Author, you are cutting yourself off from selling on those non-Apple systems.
Yeah, and that's frankly what pushed me away from the iPad as a tablet and over to Android. And of course, as I've shared with you, I'm a little disappointed only in the sense that there's a couple apps that I use like Zeit that aren't there. But overall, I'm pretty happy, and I feel like I'm leaving myself with a lot more of an open set of options for a lot of things going forward, right?
Yeah, and I think the big ones, I think the majority of apps with any kind of substantial success in the iOS world and on the Apple App Store will eventually move to, let's say, for starters, the Kindle Fire, which I think, could easily by the end of 2012 have 20 million units on the market if the analyst reports are to be trusted. So I think your kind of experience as an ex-iPad user, a current Android tablet user, is going to be, you're not going to be forever looking at apps that you wanted and feeling like, oh, they only exist in the iPad. I think they'll end up coming your way. Yeah,
I agree. All right, so let's move on then to kind of this notion of the tried and true, and the gravity pull, I guess, that they have. So what do you feel are the big advantages? I mean, to me, one of them would be they're the leaders today, but will they be the leaders tomorrow? And back to your point about lock-in, are there any issues there to worry about?
Yeah, well, I think let me start first with training costs, right, which is, I think, in a way, an issue for mid and large-sized publishers, but also, in a way, even more so for small and startup publishers and independents. Most people, and certainly a lot of the vast majority of freelance and contractors out there, already know how to use InDesign, right? So if you come up with tool X that's really interesting but totally new, you're facing the challenge of getting yourself and your team trained on them. So I think that then is a big reason. It's force of habit, but I think that's a consideration that a lot of people have in sticking with a tool like InDesign. Longevity is another one. This whole world of software and consumer technology and publishing technology obviously is incredibly dynamic. But if I had to put my money on it, I would feel comfortable saying Adobe is here for the next decade. So that feels like a fairly safe bet to make. And I think you could just as fairly as raise the question, is, for example, iBooks author going to be around for the next decade? Well, I think the best anyone can do is say, probably, but not definitely. I mean, let's think about some of the Apple technologies that have come on the market, achieved a lot of popularity, and then gone away. We go back to HyperCard, which was an incredibly popular development tool, in some ways similar to iBooks Author as a predecessor, that Apple eventually abandoned. Then a little bit more recently, iWeb, which was is their consumer-oriented web publishing tool, which for most intents and purposes they've all but abandoned. So I think that longevity is a tricky question, but when it comes to Adobe, despite all the dings they've taken for their campaign, their futile campaign, let's call it that, to push Flash, they in effect have gracefully given that up, and they've moved on. And I think with InDesign they have a tool that people know how to use and will be around for the foreseeable future.
So if we feel like Amazon is a reasonably safe bet because of their heft in the market, and Apple obviously as well, are there any startups, and maybe a couple of these would be from earlier roundups that you've done, that you feel are ones that people should be paying particularly close attention to?
Definitely, So let's, take it as a given that there's no guarantees that any of these startups will succeed, but based on, what I've seen and what I've looked at, the ones that seem to be, putting the right elements together, to me, starts with Inkling. Anyone who's followed what I've blogged about, tweeted, knows that I really am a big fan of what they've done. And without going into tons of detail about what they do, I think that it all starts with a tool that has a structured back-end approach to the way that they organize the content in the system. It has incredible respect for the reading experience, trying to make that reading experience as sort of seamless and immersive as it is in print. And as we saw last week, we finally, unveiled the biggest kind of news in their short life, which is a web publishing output capability. So where they started initially just publishing to the iPad, now they have the capability to push all that content out onto the web. And that's a development that is increasingly important as publishers and authors and all sorts of content providers try to make sense of delivering their product in a gadget universe which is increasingly diverse and a gadget sort of ecosystem where it does increasingly feel like you're potentially cutting yourself off if the only place you're available is, for example, in the Apple App Store. So Inkling I like. LeanPub is another one that I've talked a little bit about, and I included, I think, on the first one. It's small. These guys are really tiny, but I think they're doing, some great. They're providing a great service for people who have very minimal, very non-complex publishing needs. If you're looking for a cheap, easy-to-use tool that will help you format long-form narrative, fiction or nonfiction, it's a great tool. It just gets you your Mobi file, gets your EPUB file. If you start doing anything fancy, I don't want to do them short shrift, but that's where those things start getting challenging. But if you just have really basic formatting needs, and you don't want to get your hands dirty with coding, it's a great tool, and you can use the system for free to generate the files and take them away, and they only start taking a cut if you sell on their platform. I think the other tool that I will mention that, and I really can't stress this enough, there's so many tools to mention, so I'm almost picking these three arbitrarily. skewing a little bit towards the ones that I really like, but there's so many that I'm not going to mention. But the last one that I'll mention is what I've seen of the Book authoring tool. A lot of people familiar with Book as one of the original first wave publishers that really experimented a lot with incorporating video into the ebook. I don't think that quite worked out. I don't think the market, consumers, responded saying this is what we want. But they built a really great authoring tool for creating nicely formatted EPUB files that can be deployed across all the main e-reading systems. I've been seeing a couple previews recently. If you get to the point where you have formatting needs that are a little more complex and you do want to start building in things like video, what I've seen from them is pretty impressive, and I like what I've seen so far.
Yeah, I agree. Those are. I mean, between Book and Inkling, those are two that really have floated to the top of my list as well. I want to weave in a couple of audience questions here because I think the time is pretty good on a couple of these. So, first one from Edward. He says, "Isn't it true that Mobi for Kindle cannot be used in other places besides Amazon? And so, how's that different than iBook Author?"
Well, I'm sure we probably have a more. I could get more out of him if I was going back and forth, but why would you want to use Mobi anywhere else? Though I guess
I think maybe the way he's asking it is more if I've invested in creating Mobi files, I'm really only populating one retailer here. Yep. I got you. No, absolutely a fair point. And
in a way, the argument for excuse me. Mobi for Apple and Amazon sort of works the same way, which is they both offer sizable enough audiences that you can reasonably make the argument to invest your development time in either Mobi or iBooks Author or whatever the actual file extension is called, iBooks I think, because that market is big enough. You are then sort of limited to only selling in the iBook store or only selling in the Kindle store, although it's a little bit easier to make the case that if you're publishing to the Mobi format, you're probably not starting in Kindle Gen, which is Amazon's proprietary authoring tool. You're probably starting in, there's a bunch of different places you might be starting in. Kindle Gen is a great tool for accepting well-structured, not very complexly formatted EPUB files and then turning them into Mobi. So I don't think you can make that same scenario with iBooks Author where once you start adding a lot of the enhancements, you're doing that in iBooks Author, the software, and then the path out of there starts becoming legally complex because of the terms of the agreement that you sign with Apple when you use that software, but also editorially, it's hard. It takes a lot of effort, I think, to create sort of parallel workflows where you add special interactive sauce in iBooks Author and then also do the same on another platform.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I want to move along to kind of a different topic here. It has to do with channels because obviously if you're going with Amazon, you're selling through their website, and Apple, you're going through iTunes and so forth. Is there a need for publishers to worry about building out other channels, specifically a direct channel? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it depends on what kind of content the publisher is publishing, but I think in cases where the content justifies it, there's not only a need, I think this is really the big way that a publisher will survive. So, let me give a couple of examples. If you're publishing and specializing in long form, mainly text, narrative, nonfiction, or fiction, then the retailing opportunities that Amazon and iBook Store and the B&N offer are huge, and I think any publisher should feel comfortable handing over the retailing keys to those entities and letting them do what they do well, which is things like merchandise and get a lot of customers buying information and make buying easy. On the other hand, if you're doing something complex with content, like tech instruction, cooking instruction, anything where you want to do something more than the current crop of e-reading systems currently do. I think that the real benefit, I think there's a huge case to be made for publishers developing capability to sell directly. So let me give a couple examples, and let me first talk, two different ways that I think of in terms of direct publishing. The first and the simplest is simply to let people buy files directly, traditional ebook files directly from a publisher. And there's some advantages to doing that. And O'Reilly does this, and two of the big ones that sort of come to top of mind are you collect customer information so that you can then, as a publisher, market to them, and you put yourself in a position as a publisher to offer content updates. Not very easily offer those updates because then you ask the customer to then come back, download a new file, and that's really not that easy to do. But at least you have that when you're selling your files directly, and you can do things like take off DRM. But more substantial is the scenario where a publisher is selling directly and innovating with the content. So there is an outfit called Code School, which is one of my favorite examples. I hope O'Reilly doesn't further brow at me for mentioning a competitor while I'm the guest of a big tech publisher. But Code School teaches how to do tech stuff, to do development stuff, and they do some phenomenally interesting things. They are not a traditional book publisher in any respect. They're really more of a video publisher, but it goes more than video. They have interactive whiteboards and built-in web-based programming environment. So as the talking head instructor is telling you what to do, you can practice along. So they've created this whole kind of tutorial platform that their audience can interact directly with and benefit from in a way that they can't when they're reading a book on a Kindle or a Nook or an Android smartphone. And this enables them as a publisher to innovate with their content in a way that's not buffered and mediated by this third-party entity like, Amazon, and the way that it controls what happens on the Kindle device. In a lot of ways, it reminds me of Steve Jobs' sort of campaign against Flash, and he wrote a long memo a couple of years ago where he outlined the reasons why Apple is against Flash, and a big chunk of it had to do with his unwillingness to put his firm's ability to innovate in the hands of another firm. I should probably mention, and for the record, Joe is not prompting me via chat, but I'm just remembering this as I'm saying all this. O'Reilly does have the O'Reilly School of Technology, which is kind of a web-based learning environment, which is kind of similar to what I described that Code School does. But the general point still holds. A publisher who has complex content that they want to deliver to their audience is stifling their ability to innovate by limiting themselves to the innovations generated by the e-reading system makers, and that includes Apple and that includes Amazon, because when you give them the keys to control what can happen on the e-reading devices, you're letting them control how you entertain and inform your customer. And I think in genres and topics where the material can really benefit from and flourish when it innovates in the way that Code School example does, then I think publishers are crazy not investing in those kinds of capabilities, because while they're selling clearly a significant number of digital book files through the traditional, ebook sellers like Amazon and B&N, I think long term, if you think about what Amazon is doing and how they're turning into a publishing outfit and operation, why wouldn't they just start taking over each genre and topic area? But Amazon is never going to be able to. It's easy for them to do that when it comes to, plain text stuff, but it gets much more difficult when you start getting into things like tech and cooking. There's another great example with cooking I'll try to get to in a little bit, but cooking is another great example. That's an area where a publisher can do a ton by developing direct publishing capabilities.
Yeah, and I think for my money, it just feels like a lot of publishers have been reluctant to jump in and do a lot of direct channel building because they're fearful of alienating their retail partners. And, at this point, if folks don't realize that the gloves have to come off, I think that they're asleep at the wheel because you mentioned O'Reilly, not to toot our horn too much, but as I mentioned at TOC New York last week, our own website is our largest ebook outlet. It beats Amazon and it beats everybody else. And I think there's an important lesson to be learned there. And it's not like you can just put up a website and all of a sudden become your number one outlet. There's a lot of other things that have to happen there, including attracting those customers to begin with. But I really feel like the whole shift from print to digital is this huge opportunity for industry reinvention, including where, as you put it, where we want to hand our keys, and it's a chance, I think, for us to build not only a direct channel, but you kind of touched on this, having that relationship with the customer means so much more now because we can communicate with them, we can offer them other deals, we can upsell, we can cross-sell, everything else, instead of relying on a retail partner to do that for us, right?
Absolutely, but it does impose this big challenger on publishers, which have traditionally been, dominated by English majors and people who, sort of pay attention and master the art of sort of written communication. It turns publishers, or it challenges publishers to develop their skills as software developers, right? And that is a really complex undertaking to master and very different from having, acquisition editors. I mean, that's why I think it is interesting when you start looking at the moves that some of the big six publishers have made in terms of how do they navigate the balance between outsourcing their development projects and acquiring their talent internally, either by hires or acquisitions. Random House, it must be about 6-9 months ago, bought a small developer called Smashing something. I don't have the full name, but it's a small interactive agency that they brought in-house that they acquired. Makes perfect sense, I think, for a publisher of that size to at a certain point say, hey, we're going to invest in these resources ourselves. And I think the analog for a small publisher just getting started is, okay, you're not going to buy an interactive agency, but why not that next hire you make who's, the woman who's, just coming out of college, why not make sure that she's also comfortable, coding in addition to evaluating manuscripts? That's a lot to ask for one person to do, but I'm just by way of sort of creating an extreme hypothetical example, giving one instance of how hiring might start changing and is starting to change as publishers think about what they do and what their core skills are.
Right, and that brings me to the next point I wanted to talk to you about, Pete, and that is you and I can probably talk all night about the different opportunities that are out there, but I think one issue that publishers struggle mightily with is logistically pulling this off, right? Both from an existing, org chart structure to the financials themselves. And so, there's all this talk about how going from print to digital is going to be a lot cheaper in the future. Do you think that's still likely to be the case, or is that just a huge misconception?
I haven't seen any balance sheets, Excel documents, P&Ls, however measure you want to put it, in the last 15 years. And I've been through the CD-ROM era, I've been through web publishing, and now the world of ebooks. And I have yet to see the case made where digital is actually cheaper than print. Yes, of course, you don't have to, if you're just publishing print books, if you're just publishing ebooks, you don't have the manufacturing and distribution and warehousing costs of print. But at the end of the day, those are pretty small compared to the developer and salaries and the infrastructure, costs and ongoing, both capital costs and ongoing costs. The long way of saying this stuff is not cheap. Now, I think we are in a particularly challenging phase, especially for established publishers, be they big or small, where print business needs to be simultaneously maintained alongside a digital business. But I can't imagine many scenarios or many publishers' business where even over the long term, the print entirely goes away. I mean, publishers are going to need to figure out a way to maintain both of those businesses. So I think there's a bit of a lie to this notion that digital is somehow magically going to be cheaper, and we're clearly not at a point, given the tremendous change and dynamism in the rate of new devices and platforms being released, where we're not at a point where this stuff is cheaper right now.
Well, and speaking of magic, I think every publisher's dream is to basically come up with a black box that you can push in the manuscript on one end that's all been edited and so forth, and magically on the other side you're going to have multi-platform coverage. So you're going to get your Mobi for the Kindle, and you're going to get your EPUB for all these other devices and so forth. And there are production systems today, and O'Reilly has one of them, that covers that in large part. But what about the capability of quickly moving, let's say, from EPUB 2.x to 3, or as new versions and new specs and formats come out? Is that, do you think that's likely to happen in the future? I mean, we're really going to be able to get to that place where we're going to have single source in and multi-platform out as it evolves?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I may be wrong, and I'm sure there are vendors out there who would claim otherwise, but I think for any content that is substantially complex, the notion right now of single source publishing is this kind of white unicorn. Now, I will say that the one place where that my answer changes significantly is web-based publishing. And this is where I think publishers are starting to sort of view the rise of the Kindle Fire, the strength and dominance of the iOS ecosystem, the impending arrival of Windows 8 and all those tablets that come with it, and say, this just doesn't make sense. We can't afford to develop for all these different platforms, so we're going to start going to the web. And we've seen this in a couple of cases. The Financial Times and Cook's Illustrated is another example that I like to sometimes bring up for a publisher that has more or less invested all their development resources in web-based publishing, and then what they've done only for the iOS ecosystem is basically create kind of a presentation app. So the content really exists online, lets them put all their innovation resources up there, and then the app they give away for free, but the only way you can actually get any content is if you're a subscriber to the web-based stuff. That is where I think in a way, web-based publishing is not only the thing that open source types pine for as the sort of solution to the closed ecosystems like those run by Apple and Amazon, but it actually starts making business sense over the next couple of years as competitors emerge to Apple. This really wouldn't be an issue if Apple just did us the favor, in big quotes, of dominating the world like Microsoft did a generation ago. But they're clearly not. Their success is enormous, but they're not the be-all and end-all. Apple is not. So there's enough competition out there that in a way the web, I think you can make a credible case that the web surfaces as the one place where a publisher can credibly start really innovating and cutting down on their development costs for supporting all these different platforms. And by the way, when you publish to the web, you then put yourself in a position to establish a direct relationship with customers and innovate in a way that's not constrained by any e-reading system.
Right. Well, let's take this back to where we started, talking about your project, Breaking the Page. And as I mentioned, we put out this preview edition. And you and I and the rest of the team have talked about a number of ways to enrich this content and kind of eat our own dog food, as they say, where the topics and the techniques that you talk about in the book itself would actually be part of the product that somebody would purchase, and kind of wrestling also with things like EPUB 3 and how do we implement this stuff. What are some of the lessons that you've learned on this project up to this point?
Okay, so for lesson number one, and at the risk of totally undermining everything I've said over the past 57 minutes, it's hard. This stuff it's so much easier to just to talk about and to tell other people that they need to figure it out and offer sort of theoretical advice. But it is hard to do. I love O'Reilly as a publisher, and clearly I think by any measure, I'm biased, but by any measure, O'Reilly is on the cutting edge of publishers in terms of entrepreneurial spirit and technology innovation, and it's hard to come up with the best solution for implementing or publishing content that's available both on the Kindle but also showcases EPUB 3 capabilities. And oh, by the way, let's do an app in the Apple App Store. So this stuff is hard. The other big lesson I think that I've learned is that slow is not necessarily bad. I'm not necessarily exclusively talking about my ability to write, which sometimes is kind of slow, but also as O'Reilly and I and you, Joe, and others in the group have sort of grappled with, we haven't, immediately figured out the solution. And in a way, by taking our time, we've been able to, chew on a couple of different possibilities, use things like blog publishing and tweeting and releasing the preview edition, and really wait and see a bit what kind of platforms, how the platforms are changing, what kind of tools are available, and then not to mention the content itself, the material that I'm covering is changing so quickly that by going a little bit slow, it's actually, I think, been okay because it lets us sort of, really think through, what the best solution, for this content is, and so fast is not always the best way with this stuff. Sometimes I think moving a little bit slowly and sort of waiting rather than rushing makes sense.
So I'm getting a plea from folks in the crowd here to answer a particular question from Amy B. She wants to know, how would you even do direct channel on a small scale without expensive custom e-commerce apps, and just explaining the customer should put it in Dropbox or something else. So is there like a lightweight way of doing this, basically?
That's a great question. I think for truly lightweight, for somebody who's really starting out, or even a small publisher that's got 4 authors, let's say, I think it's crazy in the early days to try to build this stuff yourself, because this stuff, it's hard, it's complex, it's expensive. That would then, for me, suggest trying to identify a platform, tool, publishing provider that extracts a minimal cost while exposing you to a sort of a large enough audience. For me, that then would include an example like LeanPub that I talked about earlier. Pressbooks is another public beta tool that I've played around with and really impressed with. They let you, create your own, EPUB files and then sell them directly. LeanPub definitely lets you sell them directly. Pressbooks, off the top of my head, I'm not sure it does. So it would be the guiding sort of principle would be, don't try to build this yourself if you're just starting out. Get started using somebody else's platform who's not extracting a ton of, a big cut. Make sure you've adequately demonstrated a business case, that you've got content that people want to buy, and then once you generate a little bit of money, then you can start investing in this stuff. But I haven't seen any example in the past 20 years of doing this stuff myself and with others where this stuff, direct publishing, can be done cheaply.
Yeah. Another question from the audience here. Robert wants to know, are you suggesting that all ebooks should become apps?
No, I think that, I hate trying to guess this, but if I had to, if you forced me, Robert, to guess, I would say that we're going to see in the years and decades ahead sort of divergence and a proliferation of both ebooks and apps. The ebooks will do what traditional print books have always done, mainly text, plain linear narrative, and apps will be the place where the interactive innovation is really required. And I think that apps are going to emerge as a term that will enter the mainstream vocabulary, where people will talk about, hey, have you seen, Margaret Atwood's new app? And that will suggest that it's something different from The Handmaid's Tale, which is just a book or an ebook, whatever you want to call it. But an app will suggest a kind of interactivity. A book or / ebook will be the thing that we're used to reading, from cover to cover.
Okay. Last question for you, the $1 million one here. If you were starting your own digital publishing company today, what tool would you go with?
I think it would depend on my budget. If I was well-funded, either independently or through some investors, I would build my own proprietary platform. I would build a platform and by platform I mean a content management system that allows me to control the content that I push out. I would build something like TouchPress has done, or like Inkling has done, or Callaway Digital Arts, where they control everything, and it puts them in a great position to publish on other people's retailing systems, but also do things like merchandising and movies and, selling digital avatars and everything else you can only do if you control all your content. But that requires a substantial amount of money. If I was on a tight budget and I was mainly doing text, I would do something like a low-fee platform, like a LeanPub or a Pressbooks. And if I was on a tight budget and I had multimedia and interactivity, kind of aspirations, then I would be looking at something like Book or Atavist, which we didn't talk about today, but which is a nice authoring tool that lets you add in a little bit of multimedia extras, or iBooks Author. So I don't think there's one size fits all, but I think those are that's the kind of range of the way my thinking would go, depending on my budget.
So, and we're running over the hour here. I apologize to folks that we haven't gotten to everybody's questions. I think what I'm going to do is check with our webcast team to see if we can capture the ones that we didn't answer and maybe follow up with a radar post that addresses them. But one last question I wanted to ask you, Pete, and this is from Pat. He's wondering, and you touched on a little bit of this, but how much money do you think it would cost to get something off the ground with some of those existing systems that have already been created? I mean, is there a substantial upfront investment required?
Now, is Pat talking about the working with an existing system, an existing platform like Inklings?
Yeah, I think Inkling is one, maybe Book is another, and a couple of others that you've talked about here. Do you have a sense for what the financial model is? Is it one where somebody could get in without a whole lot of upfront investment?
Absolutely,
therefore,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that you have a great idea and the ability to, write clearly and put together some, supporting, video and image files. If your, material benefits from it, then how much money do you need, Now, if you're looking to launch a, 21st century great books publisher, that's another thing. But if you're an independent author, I mean, that's the whole appeal of going with these, existing publishing platforms that, in most cases, they don't even extract or require money up front. They take their commission once you start selling. So I think that's the whole logic. If I'm getting the question right, that's the whole logic with going with these existing authoring tools, because they eliminate the need for substantial upfront investment and let you as an author or an agent or an editor or whoever really concentrate on creating great stories.
Yeah, okay. I would ask also the audience, since as we mentioned in the opening here that we tried a different approach with this particular one, if you could let us know maybe in the chat window or even emailing us later to tell us whether you feel like this was an interesting format or if you'd prefer we kind of go back to the ones that we've done in the first couple of these roundups, that would be very much appreciated. But we've run over the hour. I apologize for that. I think it's been a lot of great information from you, Pete. I really appreciate it. I want to thank you for basically being the sounding board and the voice of reason on some of this stuff for us today. And then thanks, everybody, for being part of this webcast, and I hope you'll pay attention to O'Reilly.com/TOC for other webcasts that are coming up down the road. Thank you again.